I'm trying to think of. There's so much to this story. I don't want to forget. Giants, Nephilim. God, that's like their way of morally justifying the genocide in some of these parts of the Bible.
Megan, can you ask if the Canaanites had giants?
What's up, guys? Thanks for stopping by and checking this out. So I just want to make a response video to videos Skylar Fiction put out. I talked to Dr. Josh on Twitter after he put out an interview with Dr. Brendan Benz. The interview was called Were the Canaanites Really Evil? And I pointed out to Josh on Twitter that they didn't actually talk about were the Canaanites evil because they didn't mention a single religious text or anything that they believed. They basically just said the whole time that the Hebrew Bible was either wrong, or our perception of it was wrong, or it seemed to be antiquated, or scholarship was shaped by the view of the Hebrew Bible, which shapes how people think about it. But there was actually no discussion of a Canaanite text that was dug up somewhere. There was a political text mentioned the Amarna letters from Egypt, but as Dr. Benz goes on to point out later on in the video, Israel's mentioned in Egypt as being destroyed, and they were wrong about that. So I don't know why we like to say that. Well, the Hebrew Bible is inaccurate. We have these other sources. It's like, well, why would we consider those accurate? Anyway, that's maybe to come in another video. I did a video pointing out some mistakes in the initial video, but it turned out to be over an hour long, so I thought nobody's going to watch that. And so I'm just going to focus on this. So on that same Twitter post, Skylar said to me, spoiler alert, the Canaanites weren't half-breed angel giants, which is obviously a facile version way to put the argument, which just means that you give a neat explanation without accounting for all of the complexities of an issue. And as I pointed out, not a single text about that was mentioned the entire time. In fact, only one person asked a question related to that topic, and the interviewer just hand-wavingly said he thought that it was an embellishment. Even if it's it's mythological, it seems that that's the explanation given in the actual text. And I believe that's the case. So we're going to jump in and see if there was anything said that would indicate that what Skylar's saying here. But I just want to point out that I was disappointed in listening that they didn't actually talk about any of the work of Heiser or John Walton or Darrell Bach or any of these guys where about what the biblical text actually says in regards to the Canaanites. They didn't bring up any verses. They just kind of gave their opinions on what they believed the traditional understanding of these texts were. And it wasn't until one of the questioners in the Q&A portion asked the question, did the Canaanites have giants? And the last point before we jump in is, it's interesting to me how scholars have talked about this subject in a serious manner for years, and none of the participants, except for Dr. Ben, seems to be able to not laugh at the proposition. And this is a form of poisoning the well, to go ahead and laugh at the proposition to indicate that it couldn't be the case.
So, recently, Dr. Josh and Megan had a guest on to speak about the Canaanite. He's an expert in the ancient Canaanite civilization.
While Dr. Benz is qualified to speak in this area of Near East studies, I was unable to find a Canaanite specialization either in his bio or in the bio that Josh listed out in the original video. But this may just have been a passing mistake on Skylar's behalf.
Let's do this. I've rambled a lot.
This Bulldog 2.0. Megan, can you ask if the Canaanites had giants?
No, they may have had tall people.
What is a giant if not a tall person?
But I don't know what the average height of remains found in burial sites were.
So he admits he's not sure, but he thinks there could have been tall people there, just not giants. Well, as Heiser points out in his book Unseen Realm in chapter 25, he says, how tall were the biblical giants? Well, there's only one measurement in the biblical text, and that's of Goliath. Now, the traditional Masoretic text has him at 6 cubits in a span, or roughly 9 feet 9 inches. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls reading of 1 Samuel 17:4, it says that Goliath is only at 4 cubits in a span, or 6 feet 6 inches, and virtually all scholars consider the Dead Sea Scrolls reading superior and more authentic. He goes on to point out that archaeological work across the ancient Near East confirms that 6.5 feet would be the standard size of a giant in the day, considering that the average size of an ancient Israelite in the patriarchal period would be around 5 feet, and that the Egyptian would be 5 to 5.5 feet. Now, he also points out that, well, there may not be any unusually large-sized remains left, but that's not surprising because of the millions of people that lived in ancient Syria, Palestine during those 2,000 years. We have only a few thousand remains left to look at, because of embalming practices were not common in those areas.
I don't think there's evidence of huge doorways or lintels.
Again, he says he thinks there is an evidence, but here's the excavation of a site called Tel Bet Mirsim, just for one example, and it points out the age of 2200 to 1600 BC of strong walls and great doors. In one building, very large door sockets were still in situ, which shows the heavy construction of doors in the days of Lot. Now, perhaps this will be challenged because it's from a book called Archaeology and Bible History, but here's a similar passage from the Rutledge Handbook of People and Places of Ancient Western Asia. At the same site, Tel Bet Mirsim, it reads, only meager remains survive of the city's early Bronze Age M3 phase, covering the first 3 strata. So there's part of the explanation from the first question. There are, however, much more substantial remains in the 4 Middle Bronze Age strata, early M2, which indicate that the city was fortified in the second of these strata and had a number of large houses, presumably the residence of social elites, and displays some attention to urban planning. The city reached the height of its development as a Canaanite urban center in the last 2 of its Middle Bronze Age strata. In the last stratum, a large courtyard building, identified as a palace, was unearthed. Now, this is just one example, and it's actually one of the smaller sites. And I actually went through and read all of the excavation notes in this book on JSTOR, The Excavation of Tel Bet Mirsim, Volume 2, The Bronze Age. It was full of interesting insights about the Canaanites at this place, like the worship of their serpent goddess and how they lived. And we do know about megastructures from these areas, right? Think about Jericho, for example. And Josh he's a smart guy. He'll point this out. He says, well, there were these fortified cities, right? But, and then he'll relate it to something that his guest said earlier about a shared memory in a moment.
And archaeological remains. I think that notion is another literary trope to emphasize.
All right, so Skylar stops the video there, but he talks on mute for a little while, so I'll use this as an opportunity to address the points that were made. I think this is a literary trope used to emphasize what Israel's up against, right? He's basically using what I call the explanation of embellishment. So, for example, in the ancient world, you will find hieroglyphs and other structures that depict giants. I'll give you an example from Egypt. You'll see a hieroglyph of a pharaoh holding regular-sized people by their hair, and they're dangling like half the size of the pharaoh. Now, archaeologists who discover this will say, yeah, but this is obviously an embellishment. They're just trying to say they're pharaoh who's supposed to be half God, half man, or the son of God, or whatever. He's obviously just trying to embellish his size. And you'll see this portrayed in movies like 300, for example. But they just write it off as an embellishment. And so, but it does actually go with some of the structures from the ancient world. I mean, if you look at the pyramids
how the size of them. If you look at some of the other mega structures from the ancient world, Josh makes a fair point that, well, it does go along, it does fit the narrative and the structures that we do find. But I'll let him go on with his next point.
I was just on mute the whole fucking time. God damn it. God damn it. All right. I just want to say what a great point that was. That's all I was saying. And that it was a great point. And the reason it's a great point is if you have a whole culture that's giants, like people argue that they're Nephilim, that the structure in the buildings would have to be different. The door frames would be different. The doorways, many aspects of that culture would have would be very different because just the pure size of the people. And what he's saying is that archaeologically, we don't see that. All right, I'm going to go back.
Emphasize the miraculous power of God and the aid that God gives to the Israelites when they take over the Canaanites. So it would be like playing basketball, on your driveway, and your neighbor comes over who is like 8 feet tall, and you destroyed him. I couldn't believe it. Or the guy who you had to wrestle that was, could lift 500 pounds. Probably not the case.
No, he's partially right here that there is some hyperbolic language used. For example, in Numbers, the spies who spy out the land say, the people there are great and tall, and we look like grasshoppers compared to them. It's like saying, that guy's big as a house, right? But a couple of mistakes I think that they're assuming is that by giants we mean they're 25 foot tall. Like, keep in mind, these giants are still mating with regular sized women. And then another thing is, when we say there are giants in Canaan, we don't mean that every person there is a giant. Rather, the Bible names specific groups like the Anakites and the Rephaim, which are among these people. But more on that later.
Here's the other funny thing is that if we take the Bible at face value, that we can't explain how a group of wanderers who had no resources to create weaponry could defeat any city, much less a city or a land filled with giants. So,
Another fascinating point. Where were the resources in that particular area for these Israelites to be able to build the weapons and army would be necessary to go in and do this type of warfare, especially against strong civilizations like some of those? Okay. Keep going. I unmuted this time, though.
Now, remember, he said if we take the Bible at face value, right? Like, I think it's pretty simple. Like, here are a few of my bookmarks from that time period in the Bible. Joshua chapter 5, 13 through 15 says, Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with the drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, Are you for us or for our enemies? Neither, he replied, but as the commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Then Joshua fell down face down to the ground, and so basically he come to help Joshua. Not satisfied with that one? Okay, how about this? As they fled before Israel on the road down from Beth Horon to Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more people died from the hailstones than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. Joshua chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. Or how about in the same chapter, a few verses later, all the kings of their lands Joshua conquered in one campaign because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. How about Joshua chapter 13, verse 6, when God says, As for all the inhabitants of the mountain regions from Lebanon to Mizraim, that is all the Sidonians, I will drive out myself before the Israelites. Joshua 24, 10 through 11. I brought you in the land of the Amorites who lived to the east of the Jordan. They fought against you, but I gave them into your hand. I destroyed them before you, and you took possession of their land. Joshua 24:12. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove them out before you. Also the 2 Amorite kings. You did not do it with your own sword and bow. Judges 2:1. The angel of the Lord went up to Gilgal and Bochim and said, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Here's where Gideon has the same question as you. He says, Pardon me, Lord, Gideon replied, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least of my family. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and I will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. Joshua chapter 24, verse 18, and the Lord drove out before us all the nations.
That's good for me. That's good. We're making progress here in the Scholar Fiction.
Historically, no. Theologically, sure, why not?
Perfect. Thank you.
And why? Just one thing to point out that I always find interesting about this discussion, about sort of the idea of there being Nephilim in the land, is that this is why I sort of pointed out or tried to draw attention to during the Amarna period, during the second half of the second millennium.
That's right.
These are the subjugated Canaanites. So Egypt sets up outposts in Canaan because they've got control, and they go in and they help sometimes to put down these rebellious factions, or whatever. And so this idea that you've got this all powerful semi divine race of beings, or whatever it is that we want to call them.
Is that really what anyone argues, that they were all powerful and that they were a race of giants? Or were they just some giant rulers or mighty heroes that ruled amongst the people? More on that later.
That are running Canaan at the time just sort of runs counter to the idea of, or what we know of the period. So
I think the best I can make out Josh's argument here is that, okay, if Canaan is these giant hybrids that are made from the gods, right, why are they being subdued at some period by the Egyptians? But keep in mind, as all these pictures show, the Egyptians were depicted as giants, as well as being sons of gods, and having heavily fortified city and being at the top of technology and warfare. And in fact, you get these heroes in all cultures. You hear about these heroes from Greek culture, from the Babylonians. You get it from pretty much all of the nations. In fact, these hieroglyphs have to be embellishments unless they're just hanging out with really short giraffes or dwarves all day in Egypt.
That's right. And you in addition, you talk about how it was between the great powers, right? And so it was the stomping ground of where the great powers flexed their muscles, and they were able to because
there were no giants there to stop them.
Not that,
I was just saying, it fits well with, I think, what we know of the monumental architecture and the large fortified cities that were there during the third and early second millennia, or first half of the second millennium. And I like what you keep saying about cultural memory. I think that fits very well with that. Look at these huge, now defunct cities, but when we see the remains of these huge places, and gosh, they must have been giants that lived there. So.
And we might even be living in the middle of them, but our city is not nearly as big as it was in the past. That's good.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now, why this is important is there is a particular set of beliefs that some Christians follow that think that basically angels came down and slept with humans and basically created like a hybrid of angel and human that they call the Nephilim. Okay. And these Nephilim, this is why they're using that as an excuse for why God flooded the earth. He wanted to get rid of all the Nephilim. It wasn't really humans that he went and killed. It was more Nephilim. And the thing about it is, when you look into this idea that literally that they're these giant-like people that lived in a land. Like there's no historic accuracy to this. This isn't true. There's tall people, not giants as they describe.
This will be claim number 1, historical accuracy or lack thereof. Again, he's saying there might have been tall people, but there weren't giants. But that's literally all we mean by it. And to say there is no historical evidence for this, I think enough has been said and shown so far to indicate that this is at least a short-sighted statement.
I'm trying to think of, there's so much to this story. I don't want to forget. Giants. Yeah, so that's one of the excuses. That's what gives a reason later on. Now, this is actually another funny part of this. Is later on when we get to the parts where we're talking about going in and executing all the different like Hittites, Canaanites, excuse me, guys, and all those people throughout the land. What people like Rob Rowe and Sentinel Apologetics will do is argue once again, this is the Nephilim.
Claim 2 will be, is this what the Bible teaches or what apologists argue for? The first mistake he's making here is he says that these groups of people are supposedly Nephilim, or that's what we're arguing. But as Josh asked me one day through email, he said, does Heiser argue that all the Amalekites were Nephilim? And I said, no, only the ones that were killed. Right? Because there are passages later on where the Amalekites show back up after they were said to be all destroyed. That's why it's important to read the relevant material. And so the second part is that he is saying that this is something that people like Sentinel Apologetics argues. So is it true that this is just an apologetic motif? As well, I'm going to handle the claim of hyperbolic language because Skylar says in this video and in the initial video Josh made, he asked the question about hyperbolic language being used as well. So I'm going to handle both of those and ask, are those just apologetic motifs or are they actually what the text uses? So let's start here in Numbers 13. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. The key is that the Anakites live among these people. A few verses later, we saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them. God says in Amos 2:9, yet I destroyed the Amorites before them, though they were as tall as the cedars and as strong as the oak. I destroyed their fruit from above and their roots from below. Okay, so hyperbolic. God says, my angel will go ahead of you, bring you into the land of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and I will wipe them out. Right? So that verse said to wipe out. This verse says to drive out before you the same nations, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. Okay, wipe out, drive out. Oh, here's one. Completely destroy them. Then we read about Og, king of Bashan, who was the last of the Raphites, and it brags about his bed was decorated with iron, is more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. It is still in Rabbah of the Amorites. Now this states the rest of Gilead and also all of Bashan, the kingdom of Og I gave to the half-tribe of Manasseh. The whole region of Argob and Bashan used to be known as the land of the Raphites. It's strange that amongst all these people who are being destroyed or driven out, there are these Raphites and Anakites, but it says that too was considered a land of Raphites who used to live there, but the Ammonites called them the Zamzummites. They were a people strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. The Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, who drove them out and settled in their place. Yeah, but this is just saying that the Raphites were tall like the Anakites, not that they were Anakites. The Emites used to live there, a people strong and numerous, as tall as the Anakites, and like the Anakites, they too were considered Raphites, but the Moabites called them Emites. Hear, Israel, you are about to cross the Jordan and go into dispossessed nations greater and stronger than you, and with large cities that have walls up to the sky. The people are strong and tall. Anakites, you know about them, who you've heard it said, who can stand up against the Anakites, but be sure that the Lord your God is one who will go ahead of you like a devouring fire. So we're getting this language about wiping out and driving out. Which is it? Well, let's take a look at this. That he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, Hebron, Debir, and Anab, and from the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. Which is interesting, as Heiser points out, those would later be Philistine territories, and one only has to look as far as Goliath to understand the importance of that. How about one more? Kings came, they fought. The kings of Canaan fought at Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They took no plunder of silver. From the heavens the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. What the heck do angels have to do with the kings of Canaan? And lastly, he's going to bring up the flood, so we might as well go to Genesis 6. When humans began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were heroes of old, men of renown.
Now, somehow, the flood was to kill all the Nephilim.
Is that the case? It says, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord.
Right, but somehow God didn't finish that off. His goal was not accomplished, to kill off all the Nephilim, because some of them survive, right, and then go on to create civilizations that basically God, I think, with Joshua, will have to go and conquer, right, and have to go take over and kill everyone, including children. Let me get Anthony just got us a Wisdom in War for $2. Why couldn't God give the Nephilim heart attacks? Listen, those kind of questions are fantastic because there is no answer to them, right? The theist or the Christian isn't going to be able to give you an answer to why he couldn't have done something peaceful.
3 will be a group of theological why questions.
Again, that question is just based on the faulty assumption that the flood was made to wipe out the Nephilim. As it says here in verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them.
So why all this is relevant? This is why all this is relevant. When I'm talking about the Nephilim, how it works, this is their defense. So when Dr. Josh has somebody on and that knows a lot about it, right?
Did Dr. Ben seem to know a lot about this topic? It seemed that he just said that he thought it was an embellishment, and he didn't contend with any of the relevant literature on the topic, which I don't fault him for because it was just a question from the Q&A, but it's just kind of a silly claim to make.
And besides the Nephilim, if we take away that part, that's one argument from Christianity. The other argument that they use to defend why God orders a genocide of all these groups of people is that they were just evil and wicked.
And 4, were the Canaanites really evil? Which was the title of the video that prompted this discussion.
That was the other big talking point usually here when you hear theists talk to Dr. Josh and I. And the funny thing about that is like they assume that this culture was wicked and really evil because they read a couple Bible scriptures, but they didn't bother to actually go and do any research other than the couple of scriptures that they actually read. Okay. So when you get someone like Josh as on, he could talk to you about the culture. He could tell you about what was going on. There's a lot of data about the Canaanites, right? We know, I believe we have artwork. I think we have different stories from that era. There's a lot of information. And if I'm wrong, Dr. Josh can correct me on any of this later on. I'm sure he will. We're going to do a whole portion review of his actual video at another time. But we have all this data. Like, they weren't this monstrous evil culture that Christians want to claim that the Bible tries to make them out as. Everyone always wants to talk about hyperbolic language, right? When it's in defense of their position. Anyways, but when you talk about hyperbolic language, this is the same shit you're going to do. Imagine it, you think you're going to want to convince your soldiers to go kill men, women, and children if you're just like, some of them are bad, you know. Some of them aren't really that. Some of those people don't, they pick up sticks on the Sabbath. I've heard there's some maybe gay people in there. Like, but if you tell them, hey, everyone's evil and they're sacrificing their babies and look at how they disgrace the God Jehovah, like, they're going to come and run it. Anyways, I've talked a lot already, 14 minutes straight.
It's so interesting to me that he says Christians come to the conclusion that the Canaanites are evil just by looking at a couple of Bible passages. They don't even look at, we have all this material. We have all this stuff about them that we know. And it seems, though, that he hasn't researched any of it. Josh says the same thing, in the original video, but also they made a video together after the fact. Where Josh says at least 3 times, we have a lot of information about them. We have a plethora of information about them. We know, and we know that they were pretty common people. Well, we don't base our understanding just off the Bible passages. We know there were texts found at Ugarit and these other places. So let me just give you, in the words of Clay Jones, let me just give you one example that covers bestiality, incest, and rape. In the Baal epic, their chief deity rapes his sister in the form of an animal 77, even 88 times. That's just to give you one example. I give you that example so we don't even have to debate about sacrificing their children to a bull-headed idol named Moloch. Yes, we do have a lot of information on them. In fact, the book that I read about the site, the dig site at Tel Bet Mirsim, talks about their serpent goddess and about some other gods that they worship there. And sure, there is a lot of information. You should try reading it sometime and finding out about them, instead of just telling us how much information there is. And also, maybe, just maybe, Christians didn't make up the hyperbolic part and the Nephilim part to try and use it as an apologetic to explain away these atrocities that you find. Maybe you just cherry-picked those out and didn't have the full description, so you think that we're trying to cover our tracks because you didn't do your research up front. That could be a possibility, and I'm wondering if Skylar is capable of taking into account the verses that I gave, and there are a tremendous amount more that I could give. So I wonder if he's capable of taking what I've given so far and saying, you know what, maybe the picture that I drew was based off of cherry-picked verses that I heard somewhere. And maybe the people who read and cherish their holy book know more about it than I do, considering they read it every single day, or at least some of them do. And read the sources yourself before taking someone's word for it.